I have 4 little kids, and they're all home with me.
Okay.
And right now I sent them outside. Um,
Hello and welcome to The Wedge. I'm your host, Dr. Joyce Del Rosario. This videocast highlights Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders working towards social justice. We call it The Wedge because Asian Americans are often wedged in the black and white binary conversations on race. We are tossed around as either model minorities or the perpetual foreigners who have the kung flu. But really, API folks are positioned to help break the binary conversations to move us toward justice and equity for all people. The Wedge introduces Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders who are doing great things in their community. In this first season, we will focus on API pastors, practitioners, and academics who have invested themselves in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. I hope you enjoy this series.
so my name is EJ David. I am a professor of psychology at the University of Alaska Anchorage. But a lot more important than that, I am a father to 4 children, and I'm also a husband. My wife is a Koyukon Athabascan woman. She is from the village of Ruby, which is by the Yukon River in the interior of Alaska. And so our children are both Koyukon Athabascan and Filipino. And even though I say Filipino every time I do these kinds of interviews and presentations and whatnot, I do want to emphasize that Filipinos are a group of people who are composed of very diverse cultural groups and ethnic groups.
Mm-hmm.
And specifically, the groups that I belong to are Kapampangan. Both my parents are Kapampangan, which means people of the riverbanks. And also, I'm Tagalog in my maternal grandfather's side. So I'm both Tagalog and Kapampangan. And Tagalog means people of the river. So my family, including my wife, who is from the Yukon River, my family has a lot to do with rivers.
Well, I was so excited to have you here and to have you even say yes to my DM. But really, it's because I've been a fan of your work for a while. The first time I came across anything was your book, Brown Skin, White Minds. And you've written other books. We Have Not Stopped Trembling Yet, Psychology of Oppression, Internalized Oppression. I mean, your work is it's everything. It's everything. And I've said this to you, but I want to say it to whoever is watching this. For those of us in the field of religion and the field of theology, your work, Kevin Nadal's work, Anthony Ocampo's work in sociology, you are all saying things that first, second gen hasn't said before in your fields, and it's informing our fields. And even though we're the most Christianized nation, Philippines, in Asia, we don't hear anything about Filipino theology. And so that's been part of my work, is to build that network and to build people together and bring our sort of barangay together here so that we can talk about, our identity and faith and culture together. That's just who we are as a people. So anyway, I wanted to just give you props and say your work has been so foundational to the theology field. So thank you. But for this purposes of the Wedge, your work on internalized colonization, and because we're focused on Black Lives Matter, I was thinking about, man, what are the things that are keeping us Filipinos from rising up and taking our stance as a people, justice for ourselves as well as justice for others. But before we get to all of that, I just want to ask the simple question, why does it matter to you? If you have a story even of why does justice matter to you? I think that would give us some context as to your work.
Wow. Why does justice matter to me? Personally, it matters a lot to me. There was a time in my life when I thought, now looking back at it, and I'm going to be able to talk about it this way, but there was a time in my life when I thought injustice was just normal. So obviously at that time, I did not know that that was injustice. I thought that was just how the world
Yeah.
was.
Yeah.
You know, I grew up in the Philippines. I was born in the Philippines and I grew up there. I lived there until I was 14 years old. Um, so for the first 14 years of my life, I, you know, saw plenty of injustice. I was 6 years old when the People Power Revolution happened. So, you know, 6 years old, that's like around the time when we're beginning to develop really our understanding of the world, of what is normal, what is not normal. All right. And I grew up in a context where, you know, people being salvaged, right?
Mm.
In case your viewers don't know what that means, during the dictatorship era, being salvaged just means, you know, you got killed.
Mm.
And got thrown to on the side of the road. And but I grew up in a context where that was happening all around me. That became kind of regular and normal, and almost just expected. So um, you're
As a
not.
kid, this is what you're seeing.
Oh yeah, like, you know,
Wow.
people who tend to challenge the government in some way
Right.
or step against the government in some way, all of a sudden they'll just show up salvaged. Um, you know, so that was me, right? Growing up thinking that that happens with regularity. Um, so that influenced me a lot. And then the People Power movement happened. So then I saw a revolution happen also. And so then that also gave me some ideas that shaped me in terms of um, what it looks like when people rise up against injustice,
Mm-hmm.
and what is possible when people do that. Um, so all of those things, I think had significant influence on me as a young child. But then there are also many other things going on, right? Like, so as a young child, I was exposed to anything, to the idea that anything American was better than anything Filipino.
Mm.
So I also grew up in that context, and thinking that that was just normal. That everybody desires American things and American values, and everybody desires to go to the United States, and
Mm.
that the United States is the promised land for many Filipinos, and that once you get there, then you've achieved your lifelong dream. And it seems like for many Filipinos, it was their lifelong dream to get to the United States somehow, right?
Yeah.
Um, so so I grew up in that context as well, thinking that that was normal,
Mm-hmm.
to have this desire to leave your home country. I thought it was normal to have this desire to replace, my language and my values and my culture with another language and another set of values and another culture. So I thought that was just normal.
Yeah.
Again, I did not know this was wrong. I did not know this was, some form of injustice at that time.
Yeah.
But personally, that's how I grew up.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, I was reading the article about you from Finding American, right?
Oh
When
yeah.
you met your wife. Can you tell me that story? Like that, I
Mm-hmm.
almost lost it when I read that. When you met your partner, can you tell us that?
Yeah. So she's light skinned, right? And at that time, I was 14 years old when I moved to the United States. And as I was sharing earlier, I grew up in a context in the Philippines where light skin was associated with beauty,
Mm.
right? Light skin was just associated with attractiveness and more desirability. And so, when I moved to the United States, I saw, my wife. Well, there are many other factors. Like for the first time ever, I was going to a school with girls. Um, and because the entire time I was going to school in the Philippines, I went to an all boys Catholic school,
Uh-huh.
right? So I was not really
New.
very used to, yeah, I wasn't used to seeing, girls going to school with me. Plus I was 14. So,
Yeah.
there's a lot of things happening when you're that age.
Yep.
So, but that was, I admit it today. And my wife and I have talked about this many times, that my initial attraction to her probably has a lot to do with her being light skinned.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so there's a very romantic way of telling that story. When I first met my wife, which is like, oh, I saw her walking down the hallway, going to her locker, and she was wearing this Tweety Bird T-shirt, and
I love
so
it.
so there's a very romantic way to tell that story, but there's also like, you know, a very unfortunately a very colonized way
Yeah,
to tell
yeah,
that story, which, you know, is my initial attraction to her is largely driven by, you know, my colonized mentality.
yeah.
So yeah.
And you know, a few of these interviews, I've heard other people say the same thing of we need to know our histories. And that's part of why we need to know our histories, is because it
Mm-hmm.
affects our decision
Mm-hmm.
making and affects the way that we go about things, like
Mm-hmm.
choosing a partner, even when you're
Yep.
14.
Oh yeah.
Well, you know, a lot of your work has been around internalized depression, and so I can tell, you know, even just by your storytelling, right? Like it's embodied for you, um, and even just being able to reflect back on, oh, there's an attraction to lighter skin. There's things in my history and my people's where we were, I would say, groomed to
Mm-hmm.
love white.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yet you also mentioned like the people's movement, right? The people's power movement. And I don't know that many people at all, particularly Filipinos in the US, um, understand the connection of the people power movement to liberation, like liberation theology. To it's actually informed other movements around the world. It's not just wasn't just in the Philippines. And so it's
Mm-hmm.
actually it's so much part of our history, and I wish we could embody that too.
Mm-hmm.
So I thank you for talking about both, that
Mm-hmm.
we have both sort of an activist bloodline in
Yep.
our people, as well as the colonized bloodline.
Yep.
Yeah, so let's just dive into, I mean, I've been focusing on Black Lives Matter, but we also have anti-Asian violence that we've been dealing with. I don't know how that's been going on with you all. So yeah, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, well, you know, the interesting thing about living in Alaska is that, you know, people don't tend to pay attention to us and what we think over here and what we're going through over here. And even many Alaskans, I think, many Alaskans feel that what's going on in the other states don't necessarily apply to Alaska. You know, so specifically, you know, with racism and police violence and anti-Black racism specifically, a lot of people in Alaska feel like, oh, we don't have that here.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we don't deal with that issue here. But in reality, we do. You know, if we actually look at statistics, you know, people are more likely to be killed by police officers in Alaska than any other state except for one. I think it's Utah. I think has the highest one.
Wow.
And then Black people, more specifically, Black people are more likely to be killed by police officers in Alaska, except for another state. So we're number 2 across the country in that one
Wow.
too. And then what makes us unique here in Alaska is that we have a large percentage of indigenous people. About 20% of our population are indigenous, which I believe is the highest percentage across all the states. And our indigenous peoples here experience a lot of racial disparities, from health to education, and including police violence. So, you know, Native people here in Alaska, if you're a Native in Alaska, you have the highest risk of being killed by police. So, you know, so we do experience those issues here, and of course, racism, right? It's also everywhere. You know, and so we have those issues here, you know, slightly unique because of that indigenous component to it. You know, but then when I think about the history of this country, you know, a country that was built on the genocide of indigenous people, you know, a country that was built on the backs of enslaved Black people, you know, and, you know, and all of our systems really having its roots on such, you know, a painful, dark history. You know, when you think about, you know, the legal and criminal system, and its roots on policing enslaved Black people, right? The legal system being rooted in, you know, in really developing largely out of the Jim Crow era. The educational system in our country really developing out of the assimilationist practices of indigenous people, right? The yeah, trying to turn native people essentially into white folks, right? Like save the Indian, kill the man type of mentality, which is similar to what they did in the Philippines also, by the way. Just this, I mean, you're in a theological school, right?
Yeah.
There's the doctrine of discovery. I mean,
Yep.
these are painful histories.
Yep.
I think that Christianity has to reckon with.
Yep.
The doctrine of discovery, the manifest destiny, that idea.
Absolutely. Yep.
So a country, I think that was built out of these ideologies. It's not surprising that the systems then that ended up being developed are unfair to indigenous people, to Black people, and to other peoples of color.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So is it surprising? No, it's not. Not at all.
Yeah, it's been built from the beginning, and I think, particularly from immigrant populations like the Philippines or Filipinos, it's hard because we come in at a certain time and period to the U.S., forgetting that there were people before us, there was a history before us that we're stepping into, and also forgetting our own history, of where we came from. And so that benevolent assimilation was such a good veil to put over us. I'm like, oh yeah, we're good now. We're here in the U.S. So it's, why would we rock the boat? And I think maybe one of my big questions that I'd love to hear from you is, what is it about our internalized oppression that, how do we get through? Maybe one, help us name what that is. And then two, for maybe some Asian American folks or Filipino folks specifically who may want to say things about social justice or racial justice, how do we get through that oppression so that, we can kind of engage more in these conversations?
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's, yeah.
Just a little.
Yeah.
We've written books and books and books about
How
it.
do I? Well, yeah, but I was just about to say though that despite all my work on this, right? Despite my years of working on this and efforts to try to address it both within myself and address it in other communities and other people, it's really difficult, right? Addressing internalized oppression and completely, I guess, erasing it or eradicating it. It's very, very difficult. And I'm actually almost to the point where I feel like it's not possible to completely erase it, to completely get rid of it, because it's been so ingrained, right? Especially, just using the Filipino example, first there's Spain, right? And their idea of colorism and racism, and then the United States came on, which further strengthened and reinforced those ideas of white supremacy and anti-blackness. So for Filipinos, we have been exposed and we have been inculcated with these ideas for many, many generations now. And the systems that were developed in the Philippines reflect these ideologies, right? And the systems really have been designed to reward pro-whiteness and reward anti-blackness, anti-brownness, anti-indigenousness. Right. And so and that's been happening for generations now, where the systems are like that. And so if you are somebody who has to live and to survive in such a context, right, you will learn, right? You will learn to adapt to that. You will understand that for you to survive, you will need to adopt these ideologies yourself, because the reward systems are set up that way.
Yeah.
So it's been happening for generations, and it's so ingrained that it's almost impossible, I'd say, to completely get rid of it. It doesn't mean that it's hopeless, though. It doesn't mean that we can't do anything about it. Um, it all, I mean, I think the first step, just like with anything, is to become aware of the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Um, to acknowledge that the problem is real, um, and then become very mindful and very effortful in trying to address it. So it's almost like I don't know. I can probably think of a better analogy or metaphor. Uh,
Well,
my tongue sees. Yeah, yeah. Oh, go
let me
ahead. Go
throw
ahead. Go
something
ahead.
out to you here.
Yeah.
I mean, one is I agree with you.
Uh,
My one and only published article right now is can we be post-colonial in the colonizer's house? And
uh-huh.
my argument was I don't think we can, and for the same reasons. Like it's
Mm-hmm.
so embedded in us, and the systems are so big. But
Yeah.
I will also bring up the idea of Kapwa, right? And so I think
Mm-hmm.
this is where your book Brown Skins, White Minds gave me some hope in this, right? Of
Mm-hmm.
or I'll let you explain what Kapwa is, but well, let me have you explain it first in your words, and then I'll explain kind of where I find my hope in that.
Yeah. No, I think I know where you're heading, and,
Yeah,
and I think I agree with where you're heading.
yeah.
But yeah, Kapwa, um, with Virgilio Enriquez, right, who talked about Psikologiyang Filipino and really talked about and developed a theory around Kapwa. Kapwa really is the core Filipino value, right? And it's what puts all of these other values kind of together. When people talk about hiya, when people talk about walang utang na loob, and when people talk about pakikisama, um, those other values are just kind of surface values. But underlying all those values and connecting all those values is the core value of Kapwa. Um, and Kapwa is this sense of really connectedness with other people.
Mm-hmm.
And not just connectedness, but understanding that everybody is all on the same level.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And I want to make a distinction between everybody is the same versus
Mm-hmm.
everybody's on the same level.
Yep.
Kapwa does not say everybody's the same. Everybody is on the same level, right? Not everybody is the same, but
Yeah.
everybody's on the same level and everybody's connected. So I think understanding those two things about Kapwa is key, right?
Yeah.
Because then everything else, our behaviors, our other values, our attitudes, come from that, from the understanding that we are connected and that we are all on the same level.
Yeah.
And that once those things get distorted or I don't know, weakened a little bit, once we start seeing ourselves as separate from other people, right? And once we start seeing ourselves as on a different level than other people, like we're better than them because we can speak English, because we are educated, because we earn more money, because we have documents to be here, whereas other people are undocumented. Once we start separating ourselves from other people and saying that we're better than them in some way, then I think our kapwa, our core value, this thing that makes us human, right? The core of our personhood, starts getting weaker. And maybe it starts even getting destroyed.
Yeah.
So yeah, pass it on to you.
Yeah. So I mean, like the hope that I found when I read that was, I mean, and part of it too was I also interpreted Kapwa as integration, and maybe I'm gone, overstepping my ability to read psychology, but sort of the not only integrated communities but the integrated self, right? And where W.E.B. Du Bois talks about the double consciousness of the Black person, right? We also there's some Filipino theologians who've talked about split level Christianity, which is the same thing of sort of this white understanding of ourselves and this Filipino cultural understanding of ourselves, which is, for an example, as a culture, we can accept LGBTQ, no problem. As a religious people, totally different situation, right? It's the double consciousness. But so as I've read Kapwa, I'm like, yeah, if we could understand our belonging within ourselves and figure out how to connect those, what has been split because of colonization, does that allow us, does that mean that we can love ourselves and love our neighbors? That we can love our neighbors as ourselves because we can love ourselves more. I don't know. That's kind of
Well,
That's
yeah, I mean,
Kapwa.
yeah, I mean that, but that's the thing about Kapwa, though. I'm not saying I don't agree with you. I'm not saying I agree with you, but that's the thing about Kapwa too, is that I think we need to really better understand, what that entails, right?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, like Virgilio Enriquez passed away, when he was still relatively young, so his work, he wasn't able to continue his work. But there are many other people, right now who are continuing to do his work and are actually beginning um, to further study Kapwa. Like, what does it really mean, right?
Yeah.
What does it mean, and how does it manifest in our everyday lives? So,
Mhm.
is what you the example you provided, is that one of them? Right? Is that one of the ways that it can help us, as we navigate, our daily lives? In this particular example, our Christianity, along with being Filipino,
Mhm.
right? Um, so I don't know, but that's a great that's a good one, because I think another example there is, what about our indigenous beliefs, right?
Yes.
And how does that, right now we see a lot of Filipinos who are very, very, very Catholic, very, very, very Christian, but at the same time, their practice of Christianity or Catholicism still has tinges or flavors of
Yep.
indigenous practices. Because another way that I think some people are looking at it is, well, it's like Christianity has been used as a weapon,
Yep.
oppression, right? And so if people are talking about like using the term decolonization a lot, right? And and people for some people, they will use that as, well, if we're going to decolonize, let's friggin' decolonize,
Yep.
right? And
Needs all
anything
of
that
it.
is of the colonizer, we have to get rid of.
Yep.
Um, and for some people that includes land, right? And for the Philippines, we got our land back, right? Or
Mhm.
at least many ethnic groups in the Philippines have gotten their land back. There's still many other indigenous groups there who are still fighting for their lands, right?
Mhm.
But and still fighting colonization, of
Mhm.
a different kind today. But yeah, for some people though, decolonization means, well, let's get rid of everything that is of the colonizer. Yeah.
As you mentioned that, I'm realizing something really interesting is
Hmm.
the terms, right? Like defunding the police or abolishing the police can sound really jarring to some people, um, and like really messing with the systems like that. It can sound really extreme, especially if you're kind of more conservative, more traditional about the way you do things. But if you think about it, that's what immigrants do. They just leave the whole system. So it's, and I'm just now making that connection as we're talking, is like,
Hmm.
oh, it's not that crazy. We all recognize when the systems are broken, it's got to go. Either we go or it goes. But at least right now, the call is the
Yeah.
systems have to go.
Yeah. And the people who really don't want the systems to change many times are people who are benefiting from the systems, right?
Yeah.
Or people who, um, are not bothered by the system in some way.
Yep.
Um, right. So people, for example, with the police, and people who who get anxious when they hear abolish the police or defund the police, you know, I think many times those are people who are like, but who's going to protect me,
Yep.
right? Because they see the police as protectors, whereas for many people of color, they don't see the police as such.
Yeah.
Um, and so then many people then will ask, well, but what does that look like? A world without police, right? What would that look like? Not realizing that they probably lived that world already.
Mm-hmm.
They probably have been living in that world for many generations. The fact that they can go from their house, walk several blocks without seeing a police vehicle,
Right.
without being bothered by police, that's a world without police
Mm-hmm.
that many people of color don't have. Um, many people of color that can't even walk a block from their house without seeing a police car or without being bothered by police.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think what we are seeing right now is really, a lot of these very starkly different worldviews, because, um, of the starkly different realities, that people are living in.
From your perspective, in a world, in a U.S. context where everything is about black or white, um, what does it mean for us as Filipino Americans, as Indigenous folks, as people of color, who aren't of African descent? That was a really awkward way to say it. But yeah, what does it mean for Asian Americans, basically, in this binary?
You know, Asian Americans in general are in this weird place, right? Caught somewhere in the middle, wherein, you know, white folks can use us as a wedge, right? This is the title of your series here.
Yeah.
You know, as a wedge, to further oppress Black people and to further oppress really other peoples of color, Indigenous people and Latinx people, right? Because, you know, just for summary's sake, white people can always say, "Wait, look at Asian Americans; they're successful," right?
The model minority myth.
Yeah. So if they can be successful, why can't the rest of you all be successful, right? So then it really puts the blame on Black people and Latinx people and Native people, instead of putting the blame on unjust racist systems. Okay. So that's really how Asian Americans can be used as a wedge. And so I think as Asian Americans, we need to not allow that. I think we need to really understand, you know, that process and that dynamic. And we shouldn't be complicit in the continued oppression of other peoples of color.
Amen to that. That's true. We've preached that, and this is why it all goes into theology for me, because the church has been complicit in it as well, and we bought into all of those ideas that wealth is health. Thank you so much. Maraming salamat po sa inyo.
Maraming salamat.
I'm so thankful for you. Thank you for your time. Thank you to your kids for letting me.
Yeah, they keep popping in here. I don't know if you noticed, but I keep like waving them away. They keep popping into the door. I'm like, no. Yeah.
Oh, sweet. I mean, you know, family life is family life.
Especially, again, during a time of COVID.
Right? Yeah. So I appreciate your whole family for this time. And I look forward to hearing more from you and talking to you more.